There's a lot of emotion, pro and con, surrounding Bitcoin, and so don't worry, this video will probably offend everyone at some point, but I think both the pro and anti-Bitcoin people are going to find something of value in it and find certain positions that you agree on in this video. It's also going to be a lengthy video because it's a lengthy topic. Anybody that makes a knee-jerk reaction about Bitcoin, I don't really trust that reaction. I think even if you've got a really strong background in understanding the markets and understanding investing, it's going to still take you days of study to understand the fundamentals of Bitcoin and be able to make any kind of decent predictions about Bitcoin. The first mistake most people make when investing is they spend all of their time arguing about what is and why reality shouldn't exist. You can never get anywhere predicting the future if you spend all of your time arguing about what is. Here are so many arguments. For the last 7 years I've been making videos promoting precious metals, and so many times people will argue gold shouldn't have value, silver is overpriced. Stop arguing against what is, understand what is, and then spend your time trying to guess what's going to happen in the future once you understand the fundamentals of what exists now. So when people say Bitcoin shouldn't have value, you might as well be arguing the sky shouldn't be blue. In my opinion, it's pretty straightforward as to why Bitcoin developed so much value so quickly. Now, what's going to happen in the future, I'm going to get into that in a moment, but the reason it developed so much value is that it met a very unique need. It's actually somewhat similar to the reason precious metals originally were adopted as money over livestock. When a farmer was first offered a chunk of soft yellow metal for their cow, I'm sure they laughed their head off and thought that was ridiculous. The chunk of soft yellow metal didn't have any real value. Why should they trade a cow something valuable for that thing? But the farmer didn't realize that the gold had a lot of strong advantages. It could be hidden easily, so that when you transported that value for 1,000 miles, no one would see you walking along with 10 cows and rob you. It could also be carried easily, transported easily. And so it's a lot easier to carry 10 ounces of gold than drive 10 cows for 1,000 miles. And it's also eventually became more fungible. In other words, you could trade it for more things than you could trade a cow for. Bitcoin does exactly the same thing. These cryptocurrencies do exactly the same thing. In fact, I would say that there were potentially massive development in the history of human economics because they're doing the same thing that the adoption of precious metals did. They're bringing a whole new level of secrecy, a whole new level of ease of transport, and high fungibility. So that's why they develop so much value. If you wanted to carry $1 million in gold from one country to another, you're not going to get very far. They're going to stop you at the scanners at the airport. With a cryptocurrency, you can push a few buttons on a keyboard or carry a memory stick on your person, and you can surreptitiously transport millions of dollars in wealth. That's an enormous deterrent to theft. So ease of transport and privacy of transport are enormous advantages that cryptocurrencies have over precious metals, and that's what gives them value. Privacy of transport and an egalitarian, I guess I'd call it, network is the advantages that cryptocurrencies have over electronic fiat currencies. So for example, if you want to purchase something from an online merchant with a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin, you're going to pay very small fees, whereas if you purchase with the PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, you're going to pay 2% or so. Or the merchant will pay 2% or so, because those entities are somewhat monopolistic, and so they can get away with charging ridiculously high fees. Whereas an egalitarian currency, electronic currency such as Bitcoin, is going to charge free market fees, which are extremely low, a fraction of a percent. That saves millions of dollars, billions of dollars eventually, potentially, in transaction fees. So that has enormous value as well. So these unique and large advantages of Bitcoin are what gave it a huge run-up in price and a huge quick buy-in. However, I do see two fundamental vulnerabilities in Bitcoin. And I think that anyone who favors economic freedom should be hoping the best for Bitcoin. I'm not trying to run down Bitcoin. However, these are significant problems that I think a lot of people don't recognize who are proponents of Bitcoin. Number one, some people seem to think that Bitcoin is going to quickly replace fiat currencies. If you believe that, you have to ask yourself, why weren't precious metals able to replace fiat currencies? The reason is that the banking industry wants to retain its monopoly on the ability to create these currencies, and so they use the government to crush the opposition. And sometimes they do it directly by making gold illegal, for example. But usually they prefer to do it surreptitiously by slapping a capital gains tax on gold, a capital gains tax on the imaginary inflated value of gold, which makes it very difficult for any large entity to save money in gold, so that ultimately large entities are forced to go to banks to take out loans. Now, yes, you can, as an individual or on a small scale, you can still do transactions in precious metals with relative anonymity, but the vulnerability of precious metals and of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is going to be the transaction between those currencies and the native fiat currency. So right now, you can no longer, in any efficient manner, buy Bitcoins without giving out your ID to some entity. Yeah, you can do peer-to-peer, but you can do that with precious metals as well. You can go buy precious metals from some unknown person on the street. Yes, you can do it a little more efficiently with Bitcoin, or perhaps in some ways a lot more efficiently. But then again, precious metals has some advantages as far as privacy in these small-scale transactions. But I'm talking about large-scale transactions where large businesses or very wealthy individuals are trying to transact business entirely in Bitcoin. It's not going to work because at some point they're going to have to transact back into the native fiat currency, and then they're going to be subject to potential harassment with audits, or at the very least they're going to be subject to capital gains tax, which destroys the effectiveness of Bitcoin and gold to some degree as a store of value. So this is, and perhaps I'm not doing a good job of explaining it, but this is really how the banking industry currently retains its monopoly over the issuance of currency. Not many people seem to recognize it. If you got rid of the capital gains tax, the dollar and the euro would eventually collapse because they're inferior to precious metals and also inferior to a cryptocurrency, most likely. But the reason that these monopolies retain power is that they can, at the very least, slap capital gains tax on you and make even precious metals an inadequate store of value on a large scale. You see, if the real inflation rate is, let's say, 10% a year, and a particularly onerous capital gains tax of, say, 30% is put on collectibles and gold and cryptocurrencies, then really 3% of your life savings are being confiscated every year. So even if those cryptocurrencies or precious metals are retaining all of their value, because they're being taxed on the imaginary inflated value. So you can't save money in a truly effective manner, and for a large entity that means that a large entity won't really save money, and they will instead go to a bank to get a loan for everything, and the bank will create money out of thin air for itself and skim the interest. And that's how the banking industry maintains its monopoly currently. That's why precious metals weren't able to fully displace the native fiat currencies. And Bitcoin is not going to be magically able to get around this. But right now, it's actually easier to anonymously buy precious metal than it is to anonymously buy Bitcoin. You can't do it anymore. And the next step is going to be audits and capital gains taxes. And so Bitcoin is going to be subject to the exact same problems that precious metal is subject to. Now, yes, again, there are some unique advantages of Bitcoin, and it'll be able to fight this in unique ways, but then again, precious metals can fight this in unique ways. But ultimately, that's why I don't strongly feel that Bitcoin is not going to be able to displace fiat currency. It's a very powerful weapon, but not completely able to displace fiat currencies. Now, unfortunately, there's a second problem with Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. And the second problem is their long-term use as a store of value. Short-term, they're certainly appreciating at an incredibly rapid rate, and that's because there's a lot of buy-in because people see these big advantages. But long-term, the problem with cryptocurrencies is, as people point out, that they don't have an underlying backing. There's no floor to how low they can go. And yes, I know that Bitcoin can only be created to 21 million or so. But the problem is every other cryptocurrency can mirror Bitcoin, and people are going to buy the other cryptocurrencies. I wouldn't have been able to make that statement with certainty 3 or 4 months ago. But at this point, there's a significant buy-in to Litecoin, which is basically an exact mirror of Bitcoin with a few minor upgrades. That's without any significant upgrade, and you can think of several significant upgrades to Bitcoin. I can think of one really good one. And even if there's no significant upgrade to the Bitcoin code, mirrors of Bitcoin are going to start bleeding off value. And ultimately, long term, it's questionable whether that will allow Bitcoin to be a good store of value, which is really not that important long term, I feel, because gold and precious metals are already a decent store of value long term. You don't really need alternate stores of value. The real benefit of Bitcoin is that it allows greatly increased anonymity and ease of transactions and low transaction fees. That's the incredible value of Bitcoin. But long term, there's nothing stopping anyone from making 10,000 different copies of Bitcoin, even improved versions, and it's already proven with Litecoin that people are going to buy into these other versions. So it's not going to necessarily, Bitcoin can't be inflated infinitely, but cryptocurrencies, which are just like Bitcoin, can be inflated infinitely, and it's already proven that people are going to buy into those currencies. You can't argue with that. You just look at the value of Litecoin and you can see that people are already bleeding off value from Bitcoin and putting it into Litecoin, and there's no reason why that wouldn't continue. So I guess I'd say that first of all, you really owe it to yourself to take a look at Bitcoin. It's a potential game changer in the history of economics. If you just ignore it or take an emotional opinion in relation to it, you're only doing a disservice to yourself. The reality of the markets could care less what your emotion is. Secondly, I think that anyone should wish Bitcoin well. If it competes with, or you imagine that it competes with your existing investments, and change your existing investments. If you imagine that it competes with your existing business model, I would try to incorporate it in or work my existing business model around Bitcoin. Musashi once said that a warrior should never favor one weapon, and cryptocurrencies and precious metal are both very powerful weapons in fighting theft by the banking monopoly. They both have unique advantages and disadvantages which may be applicable to certain people at certain times. You shouldn't become emotionally attached to one or the other and exclude one or the other. It's far better to study them. And they are so complex, both precious metals and cryptocurrencies, I couldn't begin to fully detail the advantages and disadvantages of either. But this is, in my opinion, the major advantage. Cryptocurrencies are now going to offer an incredibly higher level of secrecy and ease of transactions. They're going to greatly reduce transaction fees, which used to be siphoned off by the banking industry. I question long term whether they're going to be as good a store of value as precious metals, although short term they're probably going to continue to appreciate at a more rapid rate than precious metals. Long term, however, I think that precious metals are probably going to continue to be a superior store of value and have a few other advantages. But we're basically all in the same community fighting for economic freedom, and it's unfortunate that to a degree we've been working against one another when really cryptocurrencies and precious metals are powerful tools that can be used in conjunction with one another.